Welcome back to Filling in the History. I am the amateur historian. It is great to be back with you again this week. We are going to be talking about sections 106 to 108. But there's quite a difference in this episode that I hope comes through. It actually covers a period of time for 3 revelations, but this means the first revelation is in November, and then the next one is in May, and then the next one is in December. So we're blowing through about a year of church history, and I'm going to try to do it in a very short amount of time. There's a lot of extra documents now. We're kind of getting to the point where there's enough outside of the revelations that I'm going to try to make this very succinct. However, I have made a rule that anytime that we have an unpublished revelation, we read it out loud. So there is one portion of this that might be a little long, but otherwise, that's where we are. So a lot of summarized material. And just so you know, if you're following along, we are now in Documents Volume 4 of the Joseph Smith Papers. And so let's talk about some of the documents leading up to Section 106 of the Doctrine and Covenants today. So a couple of summaries. Number one is we get a resolution from the people of Lafayette, Missouri, to defend against any foreign Mormons in support of the people of Independence, Missouri. So there's resolutions flying back and forth, and I guess another town was ready to fight for independence against those nasty foreign Mormons. So there you go. High Priest Council, the next thing we get is where Edward Partridge, William W. Phelps, Isaac Morley, John Corrill, John Whitmer, David Whitmer, Sidney Rigdon, Peter Whitmer, Simeon Carter, Newell Knight, Thomas B. Marsh, Lyman White, Parley P. Pratt, Christian Whitmer, Solomon Hancock are all chosen to receive their endowments once the temple is complete in Kirtland, which is pretty special. Now, I know that there's a couple of things that happened outside of the temple walls kind of before the actual temple was dedicated. And so these are a smattering of men that you may recognize. Hopefully you recognize those voices by now. Those names by now. If you know their voices, call me up. That'd be really weird. Anyway, we also get a letter after this to John Thornton and others enumerating their issues during Zion's camp. This was probably sent to their attorneys, more or less, to gain redress for their wrongs, right? On the 3rd of July, 1834, we get the minutes of a kind of a general council of high priests that says that they can settle issues that a bishop and counselors cannot settle. So if your bishop and counselors can't do it, then it gets sent up to the high priest general council. And today I would generally call this, and I'm sure this may be modified since then, would now be called the stake high council or the standing high council. We get a meeting on the 7th of July on how to train new council of high priests and how to discharge their duties. And then we get a discourse, which I thought was kind of interesting. It says this from the minutes, quote, after which Brother Joseph Smith, Jr. proceeded to give the council such instruction relative to their high calling as would enable them to proceed and minister in their office, agreeable to the pattern given heretofore. Also read to them the revelation speaking on the subject. He also informed them, if he should now be taken away, that he had accomplished the great work which the Lord had laid before him, and that which he had desired of the Lord, and that he now had done his duty in organizing the high council, through which council the will of the Lord might be known in all important occasions in the building up of Zion and establishing truth in the earth. For some reason, setting these councils up, I mean, he basically said, like, I can die now. And so that kind of shows the importance of these councils and this idea that I guess the Lord wants to talk in councils where two or more are gathered, the famous phrase, right? So a very important moment for Joseph Smith, apparently. We then get a receipt for $10. You got that? Enjoy it. There's a receipt for $10. After this, we get a meeting on the 11th of August, 1834, while Sylvester Smith was called out for misconduct and criminal activity on Zion's camp. We don't know what that was. Sylvester agreed to and produced an apology, which was published in the Messenger and Advocate. So Sylvester got busted, had to write an apology in the newspaper for all to see. After this, we get a letter to Lyman White reviewing what had happened to Sylvester Smith and encouraging and instructing members to try to regain their lands in Missouri. We get a meeting on August 23rd to finalize a publication in the Star about Sylvester Smith's trial and such. And then on the 23rd of August, next day, the resolution to print what they wrote in the Evening and Morning Star. So, a lot of stuff around Sylvester Smith and what had happened to him. We get a letter from William W. Phelps. This is from him, published in the Evening and Morning Star. And this letter updates people on the happenings in Missouri. The state trying to get a little bit more land from the federal government. I guess this was a thing back then when states were new. Treaties between the native nations and the U.S. government, and some other items. So that's what you get. On the 20th and 29th of August, we get a meeting where Sylvester gets everything written and then goes back on his word, justifies his former behavior, and kind of doesn't want to be apologetic anymore. He's like, no, forget that. I don't apologize for any of it. I did it, I tell you. So Joseph Smith actually recuses himself from his position on the church court because the claims were against him. So he says, okay, well, since you're accusing me, I can't be judging this, obviously, or else I'll just tell you to get out of here. But we do get this from the historical introduction to the meeting minutes here. It says, however, Smith may not have been satisfied with the decision of the council. Although he signed a statement acknowledging the justness of the council's decisions, someone, likely Sylvester Smith himself, as the handwriting resembles his, later crossed out his name and wrote under it, the above was signed for fear of punishment. This may have occurred in 1836 when Smith was temporarily serving as Joseph Smith's scribe. So this guy gets a hold of the records because he's scribing, and he kind of flips back in the book, crosses it out. He's like, this was kind of dirty what they did to me, which I think that's kind of fun. Anyway, Sylvester Smith, because of this, was removed from his council position, but maintained his sort of priesthood office, if you will. But he was no longer on the council because of that little stunt. Next thing we get is a Church of Christ account papers with debits and credits. Now, I was super tempted to go through and read off to you every debit and every credit, but I would assume that you probably don't want me to do that. We also get one for the Camp of Israel, some account pages here, I guess, to make sure that their debts and their credits and debits were all on the level. On the 8th of September, we had a meeting, which could be called an area conference or a state conference today. Joseph Smith comes out, gives instructions, trains leaders, and gives his interesting teaching about speaking in tongues. Now, I find this very interesting, so I'm just going to read this off from the minutes. It was that a certain brother carpenter had been tried for a fault before the church. When the church gave him a certain time to reflect whether he would acknowledge or not, Brother Gordon at the time spake in tongues and declared that Brother Carpenter should not have any lenity, maybe leniency, I'm not sure. He, Brother Palmer, wished instruction on this point, whether they had proceeded right or not, as Brother Carpenter was dissatisfied, etc. Brother Joseph then proceeded to give an explanation of the gift of tongues, that it was particularly instituted for the preaching of the gospel in other nations and languages, but it was not given for the government of the church. He further said, if Brother Gordon introduced the gift of tongues as a testimony against Brother Carpenter, that it was contrary to the rules and regulations of the church, because in all our decisions, we must judge from actual testimony. Brother Gordon said the testimony was had and the decision given before the gift of tongues was manifested. Brother Joseph advised that we speak in our own language in all such matters, and then the adversary cannot lead our minds astray. So I bet you didn't know that about speaking in tongues. It is only for preaching the gospel, and you can't use it to accuse somebody of a crime, which thing I had never before supposed. All right, moving on, we get a letter to Oliver Cowdery, published in the Evening and Morning Star, talking about Alexander Campbell and his efforts against the church. In this case, Joseph was kind of letting this go, but Joseph really comes out against Alexander Campbell, which is kind of odd because he was relatively silent. And actually, Alexander Campbell hadn't really published anything for a while about this. And so Joseph, in this open letter to Oliver Cowdery, really slams him and kind of digs up some harsh feelings, as we'll see in a moment. We get a meeting on the 24th of September, deciding that Sylvester Smith will stay a high priest but lose his council seats. Hiram Smith is the replacement, which happens a lot to Hiram, actually. Somebody gets removed and Hiram takes their place, so here you go again. It is also sort of resolved to publish the Revelations, since the Book of Commandments effort was destroyed. And there was a lot of talk about the importance of publishing and sharing these revelations. So from the minutes, I thought you might enjoy this. It says, the council then decided that said committee, after arranging and publishing said Book of Covenants, have the avails of the same. So you get half of it there, the Book of Covenants. And we'll get to what they almost named it. And if you don't remember, the doctrine part of the Doctrine and Covenants was what we now call the Lectures on Faith. So that was added at time of publication. Moving on from here, we get a letter to Moses Daly on the 8th of October, 1834, letting them know that William McClellan was on his way to preach to their branch. So basically, there's a letter to Moses and says, hey, Brother McClellan is on his way to your branch to preach and help you out. We then get a letter from Alva Tippett, which is on the 20th of October, talking about the redemption of Zion and their efforts to collect money to help out in that effort. So that's nice. Then we get a letter to George James on the 10th of November, telling him to come to Kirtland to face charges against him that he had not served his mission as commanded. Apparently, he was supposed to accompany Joseph Smith himself, and he never did. Not really sure what happened to that. But he was one of the first elders to be endowed in Kirtland in 1836, so about 2 years after this. So I guess he was in good standing in the church by that time, but apparently he was called to the carpet for not serving his mission. And when your companion is going to be, or one of your companions is going to be the prophet himself, I suppose they noticed. So that's a ton of history. And now we're going to light into the next thing that we get, which is section 106, which is the very last canonized section that we get from 1834. So we're kind of at the end of the year here. The earliest copy that we get is in Revelation Book 2. This is the handwriting of Oliver Cowdery. It's a pretty short revelation. There is one big correction, which is the addition of, this is Oliver Cowdery's brother, and he adds Warren's last name. So Cowdery, that's the big change that you get. It is called section 99 in the original Doctrine and Covenants. And now we're into what's called Manuscript History, Volume B. And I'm just mentioning this because I'm not going to mention it much again. This was after Joseph died. And therefore, just for the sake of not including absolutely everything, because that would be like way too much, this I normally put off because it was not actually done during Joseph Smith's lifetime. But now we are in Volume 2 of the History of the Church because of it. That is why I say, and it's in there. We get some introductions here. The earliest copy gives us simply Kirtland, November 25th, 1834. Doctrine and Covenants simply states Revelation given November 1834. And our manuscript history copy says, I continued my labors daily, preparing for the school, etc., and received the following revelation concerning Warren A. Cowdery, given November 25th, 1834. There is no difference in the modern section headings, but the historical introduction gives us a few things. It says, Warren Cowdery, who lived in Freedom, New York, had been baptized in the church sometime between May and September of 1834. So really very new. Before his baptism, he had sympathized with the saints plight in Missouri. He had also opened his home to Joseph Smith when Joseph Smith and others came to Freedom in March of 1834 to recruit members for the camp of Israel. Shortly after Joseph Smith's visit, a branch of the church was established in Freedom. When Parley P. Pratt visited the area in April of 1834, he noted that a large church was there, consisting of some 40 members or more, many of whom had been baptized by Orson Pratt. Sometime after his own baptism, Warren Cowdery noted that the members of the church in Freedom were in need of a preacher of our order who could do us good by strengthening and building us up in the most holy faith. Although he seemed to be calling for an elder to be sent to the branch, he may have meant that the branch needed a presiding authority, the position to which he was called in this revelation. In an October 1834 letter, he told Oliver that he had, quote, had thoughts of requesting you to inquire what is the will of the Lord concerning me, unquote, stating that he sometimes thought he could be, quote, useful in the vineyard of the Lord, unquote. This revelation was apparently dictated after Oliver received Warren's letter. In addition to designating Warren as a presiding high priest in Freedom, the revelation gave admonitions and promises to him and provided instructions concerning the second advent of Jesus Christ. Now, what's really interesting about this, and this wasn't uncommon, but Warren actually wasn't even present for the reception of this revelation. This was done outside of his presence, and, you know, he got it later on. But kind of special. So Oliver's brother joins the church and wants to be useful in the vineyard. So some content and so forth from this. Most of the footnotes are scriptural references in Documents Volume 3 and Volume 4, excuse me. The portion of the revelation reads this. It says, "It is my will that my servant Warren should receive and be appointed and ordained a presiding high priest over my church in the land of freedom and the regions round about, and should preach my everlasting gospel, and lift up his voice and warn the people, not only in his own place, but in the adjoining countries, and devote his whole time in this high and holy calling, which I now give unto him, seeking diligently the kingdom of heaven and its righteousness, and all things necessary shall be added thereunto, for the laborer is worthy of his hire." And the last portion of this states, "And again, verily I say unto you, there was joy in heaven when my servant Warren bowed to my scepter and separated himself from the crafts of men. Therefore, blessed is my servant Warren, for I will have mercy on him, and notwithstanding the vanity of his heart, I will lift him up, and inasmuch as he will humble himself before me, I will give unto him grace and assurance wherewith he may stand. And if he continues to be a faithful witness and a light unto the church, I have prepared a crown for him in the mansion of my Father. Even so, amen." So because we don't really get any footnotes from that, I thought I'd just give a portion of the revelation, and that is all that we have for part 1. So lots of history, a little bit of drama. Sylvester Smith is going to become a scribe again, which is kind of interesting considering all the drama there. But yeah, for part 2, we're going to be getting into a very, very big revelation. This is section 107. So stay with us.